Hello, BookTube. I have a tag for you today in my apparently endless quest to catch up on all the tags that I've seen that have been of interest, whether I've been tagged in them or not. And the one I have for you today is the board game book tag, which was created by Grace, the Beautiful Bookworm, and I saw it on Pints and Paperbacks. I don't believe that I was tagged by anybody because everybody hates me because I smell. But I thought the questions were interesting, and they got me thinking, which is always the great thing about any book tag. It's all about board games, and as I was expecting, since I am 28 and the rest of you are 50 years younger, I only recognize one of the board games in the questions, but the questions are fine either way. And the first one is Settlers of Catan, which is a gateway game. But the question is, name a book that got you into a new genre. And the first thing that came to mind was the book that finally made the penny drop for me when it comes to romance novels. I had been dismissing them snobbishly, ignorantly, forever, as just bodice-ripping drivel. And I got to know a romance fan and a romance author who patiently talked me down from that kind of condescension. And over the course of months said, it's just a type of writing. It's just a genre. And I assure you, she said, the strictures and the sort of the boxes that get ticked in other genres, like murder mysteries or especially the science fiction that you love, look equally ridiculous to someone who comes at it completely cold from another literary realm. That's all you have to do is think this is just a genre. It's operating under the strictures of all other genres, like all other genres. If you go at it that way, you'll lose your condescension and maybe get some good reading out of it. And I didn't believe it, and I tried it, and it worked. It worked like the dickens. She was absolutely right. It is a genre. That's all. It's not dumb. It's not brainless. I've met so many, in the years since, I've met so many of the women who write these novels. And I'd like to see a literary snob say to their face that they're writing brainless crap. But it's tough to do until you... And the book, I read a whole bunch of books, and at this person's suggestion, and I admit, of course, my hackles were up, my defenses had been reinforced for decades, so I wasn't quite ready for the first few. But I remember vividly the one that made the penny drop. It was Sweet Surrender by Catherine Coulter, which if you look it up online now, you will see the most anodyne and forgettable cover in the world. But once upon a time, when it first came out, it came out, I don't even remember when, but it came out in the full flush of the glory of gaudy, absolutely ridiculous romance novel covers. And I loved it. I finally realized how to love it. I realized, what the conventions were. Maybe I needed those earlier books that didn't do it for me to show me what the conventions were. Once I realized what the conventions were, then I started to be able to make the kind of discriminations that are the only thing that any reader, especially any critic, should ever do, which is not, are the parameters worthwhile, but how is the author working those parameters? How are they doing within those parameters? Nobody goes to a paper on theoretical physics looking for resonant prose. Nobody goes to a work of resonant prose looking for theoretical physics. The key isn't to disdain the genre. The key is to see how the people inside the genre do the job. Of course, there'll be varying levels of talent, enormously varying levels of talent. And it turns out that Catherine Coulter is probably not my favorite kind of romance author. Her solutions to a lot of those parameters are not really always my favorite kinds of solutions. I love her old-style Regency romances. I have a few of those. But I moved on from her to other romance authors once I knew how to do it. So I always think about that. But of course, there was a first book in any new genre for everything. I'm sure that if I racked my brains, I could come up with the first science fiction novel that I read, first book of history. I'm sure that I could if I dug deep enough. But that was one of the most recent big ones for me, because that unlocked the best-selling and most popular genre of fiction that exists in the world. So question number 2 is Balderdash. Is a game of ridiculously silly facts, words, and ideas. Name a silly or funny book that also taught you something. And the first one that came to mind is something that I've shown you on this channel. I've talked about it one or two times. It's Mention My Name in Atlantis by John Jakes, the author of The Bastard. in that whole Kent Family Chronicles series. He wrote a slim sort of parody and send-up of sword and sandal sorcery and science fiction, sword and sorcery, science fiction, fantasy, that sort of thing, starring Konax the Chimerical, the character, a broad-shouldered, dim-witted barbarian named Konax the Chimerical, who goes to the country of Atlantis, the mythical land of Atlantis, and is almost single-handedly responsible for its sinking beneath the waves. A very funny, muckraking kind of satire of a genre, and the reason I loved it for its humor, but it taught me something as well, as all good satire does, because when I was finished, I thought, oh well, that was funny, but it also accurately skewered a lot of the sword and sorcery fantasy that I read and like. So I was able to get like a step back and look at that fantasy, and that was very helpful. Let's see here. Smallworld, I guess is the name of a board game. It's a world of slaughter after all. Smallworld is a game in which multiple armies are battling it out for control of the board. Name a book with epic battles or fight scenes. And if you don't read books with fight scenes, feel free to get creative and take liberties with this question. It sort of gave me a little pang that the description of Smallworld calls forth Smallworld here instead of the game Risk. Risk is also about multiple armies battling out for control of the board. It's much older. Maybe Smallworld is the bee's knees. But anyway, when it came to an epic battle, I thought of fantasy, A Memory of Light by Brandon Sanderson. His conclusion to Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, which had for books and books and books, for just 13 books. Right from the beginning, there had been this rumored thing, this thing that was coming, this gigantic battle, the Tarmon-Gaidon, and there were all sorts of myths about it, all sorts of resonances. Jordan's fantasy cycle is one in which archetypes get recycled, so the future can echo to the past and whatnot. And of course, Robert Jordan died before he could write this epic final battle of the Tarmon-Gaidon. And he also died no matter what the publisher tells you, and no matter what Brandon Sanderson, who's if nothing if not a loyal foot soldier, tells you. He also died before he could write or outline or discuss anything about it. This is all a Brandon Sanderson book. And he delivers. In A Memory of Light, he gives us that final battle for 200 pages. And that is just incredible. That is just an amazing feat. That is one of the only Wheel of Time books that I've ever really felt compelled to reread. Although I really think that I should reread them all. At some point, I should reread that whole series. I almost did in 2000. I think it was 2018 that some channel floated the idea, and I think he did it. I think he went on to read every book, one book a month. I really should do that, but I haven't. I even got the first 3 books in mass market paperback just to sort of ready myself, but I didn't do it. I don't know. It's an achievement of one kind or another. It's also a watershed achievement in a way that isn't good, in my opinion. Robert Jordan sort of reinvented for the modern world the endless serial. Only they were in 900-page book form instead of a short story in a magazine. He invented the idea that a fantasy series should just go on forever, which is unhealthy for fantasy series. There are a number of them that are going on. They've gone on for 20 books since he started that whole thing. And that's unhealthy. It prevents the book from having any kind of meaningful plot structure, obviously. It also, I think, prevents them from having any kind of meaningful character development, because the emphasis, the stress for the reader is no longer on the character development. If the story is just going to go on and on and on, regardless of how it chews up and spits out the characters, then who cares what their personal arc is? They're going to be long gone by the time the story is over, if it ever ends. I don't like the fact that spawned a whole thing, a whole movement in science fiction, and I wish that it hadn't, but nevertheless, that makes the series important. So I should go back to it. I really should. And the next one is Sheriff of Nottingham, which is called a bluffing game. Name a book about an epic heist. I typically don't like heist novels any more than I like heist films, because, call it old-fashioned, call it South Boston Irish Catholic, I don't like stories that glorify the bad guys. Theft is wrong. Stealing is wrong. So I tend not to like them, but there was one book by Chuck Hogan called Prince of Thieves, about Charlestown, right here in Greater Boston. It's an area. It's a crime-ridden, or once upon a time, like everywhere else in Boston, it no longer has a distinctive identity. It's been gentrified into unreality, so that the monthly rent on a third floor apartment that looks over the water in Charlestown is now more than the families who used to live there make in 10 years. So just an obscene gap has opened up where it has become a place like South Boston. It has become a place where ordinary people can't live and aren't welcome. But this is about a Charlestown bank robbing gang, and one of the guys, they try to knock off a bank, and they take the bank manager hostage, and the leader of their gang falls in love with her, and she falls in love with him, and he starts to dream that he can have a life outside of the one he's ever known. He starts to dream of a life with her, and then another heist comes along, a bigger, more glorious heist, and it's very, very well done. It's a very well done book. I think it was made into a Ben Affleck movie. I don't think it was called Prince of Thieves, but whether it was or not, don't judge it by that movie. Judge it. Try it yourself if you're interested in, for instance, Boston fiction. But also, it's really good. It wouldn't matter where it was. It's just Chuck Hogan did a really good job. The next thing I read by him was The Strain, a really, really good vampire novel, contemporary vampire novel that he allegedly wrote along with Guillermo del Toro, but I don't believe that Guillermo del Toro had anything to do with that book. I think it was all Chuck Hogan. I really like that too, so I'm interested to see where this guy's career goes if he doesn't just get sucked up by Hollywood. Then Monopoly is the next one, the only game on this list that I actually know. Monopoly is a property training game that involves buying and selling properties, paying rent, and trying to send everyone else into bankruptcy. I would have reversed those. The game Monopoly is not a property training game. It's a game of betraying your friends for money. But one way or another, name a book that most resembles your real life. Maybe the main character shares your same profession, or maybe it takes place in your hometown. And as always, feel free to be creative. And my profession is writing for hire, and that immediately made me think of New Grub Street by George Gissing. George Gissing is a weird novelist. He's a very hit or miss novelist. And the minute you learn anything about what his real life was like, you wonder if he could write anything at all. When he writes a bad book, it's really bad, really, really bad, lazy and completely tone deaf, and in such a basic way that you're in the presence of a writer who doesn't have any idea what a plot structure is, any idea what is dramatic. You look at a story of his, like, I don't even know. I could name half a dozen of them. The Whirlpool was the latest one that I read. You look at some of the novels, you force your way through them, and then you get to the end, you say, okay, well, that was terrible. But it didn't have to be terrible. I'm no shakes as a novelist, and even I can look at the plot, the people, and the events in this story and see, oh, if you rearrange them just like this, then boom, it'll work. It'll work much better. But when he's on, he's really on. His book, The Odd Women, is worth your time to read, very much so. And so is New Grub Street. And New Grub Street is about people who write for hire. so I had to... I had to think of that. There's Poles in the book. Edwin Reardon is one, and Jasper Milvain is another. Those are two main characters in New Grub Street, and they represent two different ways of going about being a gun for hire, being a writer for hire. And every writer that is Jasper Milvain thinks they're Edwin Reardon, and every Edwin Reardon is terrified of becoming a Jasper Milvain. So I don't know where I stand on the spectrum, but even thinking about the book for the purposes of this tag made me want to read it again. Then the next one is Seven Wonders. Seven Wonders is a game in which you use cards to build one of the seven wonders on the table in front of you. Name a book with awesome world building. And you immediately think, when you think world building, you immediately think science fiction and fantasy. But I thought of something else that was on my mind when I was reading The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. And that is the Matthew Shardlake novels of C.S. Sansom, C.J. Sansom, that are all about a lawyer in Tudor London named Matthew Shardlake, and his family and his dealings with the events that are roiling through society, from the closing of the monasteries to the changing of Henry VIII's wives to the burning of heretics. These are meticulously done books. They've ballooned in size because the author is so concerned with world building. I think that word applies just as well to historical fiction as it does to anything else. And that was the first thing that came to mind because they're never going to be critically praised the way the Hilary Mantel's Cromwell novels are, and yet they're tremendously good. So that was my answer there. Then the next one, the next one just shows you when this tag was made. There's a dividing line in all our lives now. There's a dividing line. Usually we would say there's a dividing line, and then you would add caution. You would say, well, it's a dividing line for me in my country because we just elected a president, but it's not going to matter to you. You're not even going to know what it is. Or it's a dividing line in my country because we're having wildfires out in the West, and they're consuming lots of land. But it's not going to be a dividing line for you because you live up, in a temperate country that doesn't have wildfires. But no, now, in March of 2020, we now all have a dividing line. All of us do, and it's this pandemic, this worldwide pandemic, and this question. This tag was clearly constructed before that pandemic hit the news, because the next one is a book called a board game called Pandemic. Pandemic is a cooperative game in which all the players are working together to eradicate diseases from the board. Name a book with an epic squad of friends. And it's a book by technicality here because it's been collected into hardcover graphic novels with ISBN, so that is a book. But as far as I know, there's never been a novel. There's lots of fan fiction, but never a novel. And this is the Legion of Superheroes. It's a thing that I talk about often on this channel. It's from DC Comics, the home of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman. And it's a team of superpowered teenagers 1,000 years in the future who fight injustice and world-conquering galactic villains and date each other, rather. And the Legion is huge. It's 17, 18 people at least. And no matter what their squabbles are, and no matter who they're dating, and no matter who likes who or doesn't like who, or how abrasive their personalities may be, they're an unbelievable team. They come together when they have to. It's a tremendous thing. There's currently a Legion of Superheroes comic book that's not totally horrible. Not yet, anyway. It's not totally horrible. But I also have an entire shelf of Legion. I wonder if I could show you with this thing. Yeah. I have an entire shelf of Legion of Superheroes stuff right there by the bedside that I regularly consult when I need to pick me up. So there is no, as far as I know, there is no novel of the Legion of Superheroes. There's plenty of fan fiction on fanfiction.net. I think there's some on Wattpad. I wish there were a novel. And if DC Comics, if Paramount is going begging for a novel, I'd be happy to write it. I've actually been tempted many times for NaNoWriMo to just do an epic piece of fan fiction for the Legion as my NaNoWriMo project. I don't know. Maybe not the main thing, but Camp NaNoWriMo is coming up next month. Maybe then. But anyway, the next and last question is Ticket to Ride, which I guess is a board game. It's a railway game themed game in which players are trying to connect train routes across a map. Name a book that took you on a journey. And the first book that came to mind is In a Sunburned Country by Bill Bryson, who is famous for his gazillion-selling book about walking the Appalachian Trail here in the United States. But In a Sunburned Country is about Australia, which is one of the only places in the world where I have never been and never will be. So I'll never actually set foot in Australia. I will never actually face smooch with a dingo. I will never see Ayers Rock or any of the great geological or natural formations. I will never get to know Australia the way I've got to know so many other places. Never been to New Zealand either. So I thought when I thought taking on a journey, this books about Australia and New Zealand, that sort of thing, are the only kinds of books where I'm guided only by my imagination. Everything else, everywhere else in the world, even Antarctica, I'm guided by my imagination, by the power of the author, and also by my own memories. But not when it comes to Australia. It's totally incognita to me. So that was the one that came to mind, and I liked it. I liked it a lot more than I've liked any other Bill Bryson, probably because of that fact. And that's it. That is the board game book tag. all I want to do is tag people here, and I want to tag the members of the OGBG who are now all reunited, the Old Geezers Book Group, or as Jason Harrigan put it in his video this morning, the OBGYN. I'm not sure that any of us are qualified, or that you'd want us along for that particular journey. But Mark Richardson at Richardson Reads, Jason himself at Byways in Brooklyn, Todd at Todd's Bursting Bookcase, but also David Wardrop, and Sue at Sue's Book Nook. I'd love to hear not only your answers to these, but your familiarity with any of these games. Do you know any of these games? I could swear that I've seen a stack of board games at the old farmhouse up in Vermont, but I don't recognize any of these titles except Monopoly. Oh, and of course, Britta. She has tags to do. What's one more? So that is the board game book tag, and I'm going to chip this off the pile and keep going with these tags. So I will wrap this up for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.